Welcome to the Great CoverUp with Ann McMan. I'm Sheena, and Ann is joining me today to talk about covers. Ann, thank you.
Thank you for asking me to participate. I'm thrilled.
Episode 2, Knowing What to Look For in a Great Cover. In this episode, we're talking about how to create compelling covers.
I can talk to you about the things that stand out to me. You know, because I do this all the time, you know, to push myself and to try to make sure that because there are trends, as you know. I mean, there are trends in cover design, just like there are trends in fashion. You know, in Pride and Prejudice, when Mrs. Bennet is bemoaning her fate because long sleeves have returned, you know, to gowns. You know, the same things happen in book cover design. Things come in and fall out of fashion, and you always want to kind of keep your toe in that pond, right? What are people doing? What do the best writers have on their covers? You know, so I try to do that a lot. I try to spend usually I just get really depressed. You know, because I look at them and think, oh man, I want to do covers like that. But, you know, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you get lucky and you get to do exactly the cover you wanted to do. You know, and I've had a few of those. Most of them have been for Bywater, but I've had a few of those where I had an idea about something I wanted to do that I thought was dramatic and edgy and provocative and eye-catching, and that really spoke to the message of the book, and they've sailed right through. I've gotten to do a couple of those. You know, but usually I go back to my see-through frog, and it's usually like that's the first thing you give, and then you have to start throwing the layers on top of it, you know? But to me, what makes a compelling and effective cover is something that, okay, I read an article a while ago that just caught me up by the short hairs, and it was actually about graphic design in general and how much graphic design has changed and how much graphic design has changed us as consumers. The reality that today, the average person in our culture sees more graphic images. Think about that in terms of packaging and signage and things on the internet and books and magazines. The average person sees more pure graphic images in 1 hour than a Victorian saw in their entire lifetime. In 1 hour. So that's what you're up against. You know, you're up against a consumer who is constantly under attack by thousands and thousands and thousands of graphic images coming at them from every place. And now they're animated, and now they have sound, and now sometimes you have to listen to them whether you want to or not. And it's all over us, and it's all around us. Even our cars now have maps and things that are animated and moving and talking and little pictures flashing and all of it. It's everywhere. It's all around us. Book covers are the same way. And the best thing that you can do is give somebody a break. Give them some respite. Give them a thing to look at that is simple, that's direct, that they can access and understand in just a second. Because a second is about how much time they're going to give it. That's it. When I was starting out in the old days as a designer, one of my favorite things to do was to go to the mailroom in the college where I worked. And I would literally watch people come in. This was in the old days when they actually had the walls lined with pigeonholes, you know, and everybody had a box and all your mail got stuffed in there. And this room had a trash can that could have had its own zip code. It was huge because every person would come in and go to their mailbox and walk over to the trash can. And they would start flipping through stuff, and 95% of it would be unopened and go immediately into the trash. And I was working then as the person who was creating fundraising advancement materials. And a lot of that's direct mail. and the way you design direct mail is a whole lot the same way you design a book cover. It is intended, nobody's going to open it. They're going to look at the front of it and they're either going to hang on to it or it's going to go right in the trash. Or in the case of a computer, they're not even going to stop. They're just going to keep scrolling. So I learned a lot. What were the things that people threw away and what were the things they actually picked up and looked at for a second and then threw away? But at least if you get that second, if you get them to kind of go, oh, wow, this looks kind of intriguing. And then the next thing is, do they turn it over? Or in our case, if they're not in a bookstore, does the cover catch their interest enough that they're going to click on it and want to go, what is this about? This looks really cool. They might read the blurb. Then you got them. So to me, you want to visually give the consumer, give the potential reader a break. Show them something that's simple and direct and easy and compelling and accessible. Clear, clean, consistent typography. There are 800 million typefaces, only about 12 of them should ever be used. And almost none of them should ever be used in combination. At the most, when you're doing a book cover, you should pick 2. And that's it. 1 serif, 1 sans serif. And use them consistently and make sure they're readable. And when you're looking at that cover, make it as small as you can and see if the title of that book and the author's name is still readable. That's what you want to do. So those are the things I look for. Color. Back in the days of film, when movies were all black and white, and first it was the introduction of sound that changed everything. Then it was the introduction of color. And some of the greatest directors, I think it was the Russian filmmaker Eisenstein, said you should never use color unless it has a reason to be there. Unless it tells you something about the story. Otherwise, it's just gratuitous. Well, none of us would agree with that now. But I remember back in the, I think it was in the 70s, there was an Italian film called Garden of the Finzicontinis, and it was based on the novel. And it's a movie about when the Nazis came into Italy and gradually took it over. They invaded it and they took it over, and how all of these wealthy families lived in their bubble and wealthy Jewish families and paid no attention at all to what was happening. They ignored it. They didn't think it was serious. They didn't think it mattered, until it was too late. And of course, by the end of the film, they were all transported to camps where they died. But what the director did in this movie, and you weren't even aware of it when you were watching it, as the movie is going on, he is gradually sucking the color out of the film. And you don't even realize it until the final scene. It's completely black and white. Because that's what happened to their lives. It went away. So what does that have to do with book covers? Everything. So you need to go back to the frog. You need to start with the simplest, most basic, most direct thing that gets at what is the heart of this book. What is the one thing this book is about? And then you add things because they need to be there. And only because they need to be there.
So let's talk about people. You said in the first episode that you don't always add people to covers. But
Right.
There's this general belief that people on covers sell better than covers without people.
I think it probably is. I think particularly in certain genres like romance, it might be like a chicken and egg thing. I'm not really sure if they have to be there or whether we just believe they need to be. I'm not sure which one came first. It might be because romance novels for so long have been defined in a certain way that if the covers aren't presented like that, I think a lot of times authors fear that a potential reader won't know the book is a romance because it doesn't look like other romances. So I think there's that kind of tension going on all the time. I think that putting people on covers is fine and that many times it's the best approach you can take. But I think where it can go off the rails very quickly is when the client, whether it's a publisher or an author, becomes very specific about how the people need to look. If you're, there's like a school of thought that if you put a person on a book cover, that person has to look exactly the way the person in the book is described. And I think that becomes a problem. First of all, there are a lot of readers who don't want you to tell them what the person looks like. They want their own idea. If I say, hey, this is what, pick an example, like Harry Potter. What if the person who did the original Harry Potter cover made him look in a completely different way? Everybody now identifies Harry with the way the kid in all those illustrations looks, right? But on a romance, if the protagonist is a long leggy, sultry blonde with long flowing hair and stuff, and you put a person on the cover who looks nothing like that, then you sort of set up this tension. So I generally don't like putting people on covers for that reason, but I do it. Like I said, I think there are times when it's the most effective approach you can take. But when I put people on covers, I usually try to use the idea of a generic person versus somebody who is intended to look exactly like the main character. I know there's also I remember there was a session at GCLS a couple years ago about this very thing. The trend particularly in lesbian cover design, of the Headless Woman, where the depictions of women are pretty much limited to what I would call their business parts. They're basically just torsos. And that's kind of icky because it does play into that whole narrative that, women are just about sex and nothing else about them has any integrity or merit. But at the same time, I can understand how that happened, because probably the authors and the cover designers could never reach consensus on what the person needed to look like, so we just lop off their head.
I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah. And then we get into the thing also where we'll see lots and lots of romance covers where you only see women from the back or the side. Like you might actually see the whole figure, but it's not focused on their face, or they're not looking right at you. They're never like looking off the cover at you. They're usually staring off at something, or, some other technique like that sort of minimizes the particular attribute. The other thing that you get into there, I think, is one of the pet peeves I have are these idealized images of women who, in my view, not only don't look a whole lot like most of the lesbians I know, but who also sort of cross over into some of the potentially unhealthy stereotypes the media and advertising have generally about how women are supposed to look. Mm-hmm. We're all supposed to be swizzle sticks and, have glamour length fingernails and, and I mean, it isn't the case that there are no women like that in our culture, because of course there are. But I think that we need to be careful not to only show that, because in some ways we sort of, cross over into the same sort of unhealthy patterns of identifying women that we've all struggled against with men for centuries. That we're not just sex objects. Although of course I am, but most women.
Well, that's interesting actually, because then you're absolutely right, because the depictions on book covers are what's appearing in the reader's heads if there's an image of a person, right?
Right.
So young readers, as they come into the sector, they start looking at this is the model I should be. This is, even if it's a subconscious thing.
Right. There's an element too of, when you think about younger readers, there's so much we just don't know about, the demographics of who is reading what and how people select the things they want to read. Like I know I would love to have some good, credible information about young adult literature, which is huge. But I confess that I have next to no information about how people we would classify as young adult readers select the books they buy. What do they look for? And I understand the value of wanting to see books that look like they're about people like me. And I remember in the early days when I first discovered lesbian literature, back in the, 80s, I guess. I was a late bloomer. I was actually like 30, 31 years old when I realized I was a lesbian, and went and got a part-time job in a gay bookstore because I knew nothing about it. And I remember the books that were available then, and none of them had women on the covers. I mean, unless you read like Pat Califia or something, most of them had these very sort of pastel, beatific little, landscape scenes, with like sunsets and stuff like that. So there was like it wasn't like you would go find a book that had women who looked like you on it, because that just didn't exist. So I do appreciate that there's a value to that, that you want to go and find books that tell stories that talk about the experiences of women who are like you, who have things in common with you.
To a point, but also when you're in that young adult phase, you are looking for models, people who you can emulate, people who you could become, especially if you're, like I was, the only gay person in my entire family, and I had no friends, and I had nobody to, so lesbian fiction was what I emulated for a long time. That was my model.
Right. And I remember all the books I started reading. And thankfully, many of those books are written by authors who are still writing today. But, for the most part, they told stories about women who were idealized. I don't know. I feel like we're veering off topic here, but I guess that's okay. But they were these very sort of idealized stories about really beautiful, accomplished, super women who just discovered that they loved other women, but that was kind of where the similarities stopped, so I don't know. I mean, I think it's a tension for us. I think as we begin to tell different kinds of stories now, because now we can get married. Now we can have children. We can adopt children. We make families. And guess what? We get divorced. So there's that whole thing now, right? How do you write about that? You've got to tell those stories. Well, many of us now are at the time in our lives when we're thinking about things like long-term care. I don't have anybody to take care of me, or come in and manage my, I have Salem, of course, but we don't have children, so you begin to sort of look around you at all the things you've collected, in your lifetime that matter. And, one day, unless I go out in a blaze of glory, which is my plan, I'm going to end up in a nursing home somewhere. We need to write about that. What's that like? Where do gay people go? Where do we go? Are there places that will let, lesbian couples be together? There are. They're expensive, way expensive. But those are parts of life experience that are now part of our culture, and they need to become part of our literature and the way we talk and write about ourselves. But, a lot of people don't want to read that stuff. Yeah, I remember what K.G. McGregor taught me a long time ago, and she said this very lovingly. I mean, it wasn't critical at all, but she talked about her one-handed readers. Think about that. That's a reality, and that's a needle, that those of us who are writing and those of us who are designing the front doors that go on these stories, that's a needle that we all have to thread.
You're listening to The Lesbian Talk Show. TheLesbianTalkShow.com, your hub of podcast information.
Okay, so let's talk about designing covers for the erotic literature. I mean, what are you doing differently to romance? What's fundamentally the difference between those two?
Between romance and erotic literature?
Covers.
I can't joke and say the lighting. I don't know that I've ever done a cover. Well, yeah, I have. Maybe, gosh, in my career, maybe I've done like one or two covers for erotic books. I don't consider that a strong suit of mine, probably because I don't really read, eroticism. There's not a thing in the world wrong with it. I mean, it isn't like I have an issue with it. It just isn't a subgenre or genre that I know a lot about. I would suppose that, and for the couple of books where I have worked on those, I've tried to do things that are more graphically evocative, maybe more dramatic use of color, maybe lower contrast in images, and maybe things that sort of hint at what you cannot see, because that's kind of where that's where that lives. So versus a romance where mostly with a romantic book or story, you want to stick with a lighter color palette. You want to try to use imagery and typography in a way that's warm and, embracing and uplifting versus sort of ponderous. I think many romance writers have a real fondness for cursive typefaces because they have a belief that there's something about that kind of florid writing, that's really consistent with the idea of romance. I don't really agree with that, but I understand it, because it is so prevalent in the genre, and that probably is, how they'll talk about a card player who has a tell, like a facial tic, or if they get a really good hand, their nose twitches or something like that. So, I mean, I do think that in cover design, there are some tells that you can build into the way you approach it that are going to tip a reader off immediately that that's what this book is. So they'd be things like a softer color palette, sometimes images that have like the design equivalent of a ghost filter, and generally a combination of fonts that will include at least one typeface that has some sort of florid or handwritten element. Whereas with erotic novels, or erotic literature, I would tend to think of covers that are more suggestive, kind of murkier, probably collisions of colors versus harmonious. I'm probably going to get pilloried for that. Don't hire me for that.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the tells for the other genres. What about a drama?
I think in a lot of cases, for a book that's like a thriller or a mystery, I got to do several covers for Ellen Hart. And I love designing her covers because, and I'm not the person who created her brand either. I inherited it. A really fine designer named, I think it was Bonnie Liss, who actually originally created sort of the brand. I'm not talking about the St. Martin's covers, which that's sort of would be an interesting laboratory thing to discuss. Ellen's ebooks are produced by St. Martin's Press. They do not do paperbacks. Bywater did Ellen Hart's paperbacks. So Bywater had the contract for those. So the paperback designs were always completely different from the ebook covers that St. Martin's would do. But in her paperback designs, to me, they were really, really effective and genius. The designer who originally created the brand used very dramatic black and white photography, usually showing one person or one element. And then there is a spot color, one spot color that comes into play somewhere in the photograph. And one of the covers I got to do for her was for her novel Taken by the Wind, about a young boy who's kidnapped. And I used a really stark black and white photo of he's probably 12 years old, 10 or 12-year-old boy. Part of his face is cut off, so you see half of his face. and I have one tear coming down his cheek that's blood. And that's it. That's the only image on the cover. And then the rest of it is her brand, where it has her name and the title of the book. So to me, when you're talking about a book that's, a mystery, a drama, a thriller, you want to pare the elements down. You want to try to evoke a sense of dramatic intensity through sparing use of color and images that have really high contrast. Almost if you go back and think about, film noir, all those wonderful old Bogart movies, Broderick Crawford or Lauren Bacall, all that, that kind of where they always had this really dramatic light and big shadows. And then I would use always very, very sort of clear, maybe almost blocky typography versus something fussy, which by definition suggests that the content of the book is lighter to me.
Okay. And then versus something like comedy.
Yeah, comedy I think you can have a blast with, honestly. A lot of my books are humorous. Usually they combine both elements of comedy and drama, and I try to, weave them so they work back. And I always try to think of it as like boxing, where you're dancing around somebody and you're feigning and you're feigning and you're feigning, and then you land a punch, and then you go away from them and you dance a little more. So to me, approaching cover design is the same way. You want a little bit of liveliness. You want a little bit more action and animation, in the cover for something that's funny. I think particularly with humorous books, it's an opportunity to do something really fun with the type. Like, let the type be the design. Do something funky with the letters. Like, drop one of the letters so it's kind of hanging out of the title, or put something in there that's backwards. That kind of thing. So I try to do that. My favorite covers are the ones that are driven almost entirely by the typography rather than the image. I don't know. Are you familiar with the cover for Anna Burke's book, Compass Rose? That's one of the best covers I've ever designed. I just love that cover. And it was a hard sell. It was a hard sell to me with the publisher and the author to get them to agree with the fact that I broke the title of the book, not between the syllables. I did it intentionally. So the way the words broke was really like off kilter, and you really had to look at it to kind of go, what is, but I felt like it worked because to me it said everything about the plot of that book and about that main character, Rose, for whom navigation and knowing exactly where she is at any moment is instinctual to her, but in her private life is completely at sea and has no clue where she is. So trying to come up with something that would really evoke the tension between those two things, and I put those jellyfish in the background, because they're kind of what in her book, they're sort of like the plague of the sea, the bad guys who can sink any ship. So that's why I did that. I intentionally broke the words in wrong places to send that message about this character.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love doing that with type. It's my favorite thing. The type has to be there. Make it do the heavy lifting. And I would say this to authors: work with somebody to help you come up with the right title for your book. Because usually the author is the worst person to do that. And there's a joke at Bywater. Like our authors, a lot of them will say, I'm not even going to put a title on this because I know you're going to change it. But sometimes that's better for you. Sometimes it's better to let somebody else say, no, this title really works better for the story you're telling. And it's going to be quick and direct and people are going to get it. And plus, I can do really cool things with it.
So you ideally want shorter titles because long titles are cumbersome on covers.
They are. They're way cumbersome. There's like a level of sophistication that comes into picking the right title of your book that relates to, what's the term? It's not like algorithm. It's like some kind of search metadata thing. Like you don't want because there are going to be 800,000 trillion million books that begin with the word the. So you want to try to come up with titles that are going to, I think there's actually a psychology to naming conventions. Like it's really good to have the first letter of your title be an A, because it's going to float right to the top in any kind of search, thing like that. So yeah. So, I think shorter titles are better. I think subtitles are useful in historical monographs and academic work. But if you've got to add a subtitle to the title of your book, you don't know what your book is about. This is like, it's like, simple, pare it down, take things away.
The exception to that would be if it's part of a series and you want the series title on there.
That's true. And you can do that. There are ways you can do that. You can put it up, you put it on there small, you track it out across the bottom. And, the other things about a series brand, there are we talked about like tells a card player has, when you do a brand for a series, you're going to standardize the placement of the elements. The author's name is going to be in the same place on every cover. The title is going to be in the same place on every cover. The style of imagery will be the same. It can be different. It can be, obviously, it would be a different image. But on Ellen Hart's book, the style of the images is the same on every book. You're going to have a black and white image that's really compelling with some piece of it pulled out and presented in a contrasting color.
The font of the author's name and the font of the title, are we keeping them the same?
I keep them the same in terms of where they are, their placement, and how you deal with them. Is the author's name always in all caps? Then it needs to be presented exactly like that on every book. You wouldn't put it in all caps on one book and in upper and lowercase on the second book and have it at the top on one book and at the bottom on the next book. You want to standardize those elements so that when someone is looking for, I don't know if I've read all of the Jane Lawless books, that you look at them all and you can tell, oh, I read this one, not this one. This one's red. This one's blue. This one's lime green. This one's puce, that kind of thing. And, you can do something too with the particular way you brand. Like Georgia Beers hired me to actually brand her name, so that her name looks exactly the same on every one of her books. And that's a really good thing to do, particularly, I think, when you're as successful and as prolific an author as she is, and people want to find her stuff. So I was thrilled to work on that with her. And, I found a perfect typeface that isn't one that's used much at all. It's not like a common one that you see. I made sure that I got one that had, they're called ligatures. I got her permission actually to purchase this font family because it was expensive and made it clear that I would only use it for her. And then when I created her author brand, I spent hours kerning and putting the letters together in a certain way, so that some of them overlap each other and, so that now when you see that, immediately that that's a Georgia Beers book.
It's a great brand. It's strong. It shows that it's a romance author, not a thriller author.
Right. What I would love to have someone say about me as a cover designer is that I had really good typography, that I use type well, that it's clean and it's clear and that I understand how to use it. That's what I would like at the end of my life. If anyone ever cares to give me an epitaph, that's what I would like to hear. Wow, boy, she really knew how to work with type. I would feel like I had done my job. But what I would say about fonts, we talked a little bit earlier on about stock art, where to get good stock art images and the difference between high quality and not so great, and making sure that you're appropriately licensing things and not just grabbing them, without paying and all of that. What I would say about typefaces is the same thing. The internet is flooded with sites that offer free fonts. You can go and you can find a knockoff typeface for just about anything that you're going to be able to download for free. Well, here's the issue. Some of those are created by people who intentionally are ripping off something else that another person designed. And if you don't pay attention, a lot of times when they say that they make the font available for free, what they mean is it's free for you to use for personal use. So, Sheena, you want to make yourself a new resume, and there's a typeface you really like, but you don't want to go and pay $150 for it. So you look around and at, DaFont or one of these other sites, you find a free typeface that looks just like it, and it says it's free. You download it and you use it. Well, that font is free for you to use as long as you don't create a product or put it on something that's going to be sold. Those fonts are protected against that. So if you read the fine print, a lot of times it'll say free for personal use, but you can't put it on a book cover. That's illegal. And a lot of times the people who create those fonts will code them down inside all the weird computer stuff that none of us get to see. They'll actually code the fonts so that they won't embed, which means if I have a copy of Photoshop and I want to make a book cover and I pull this typeface in, or I'm doing a cover in, PowerPoint, or you mentioned CorelDRAW or what, some other program, and it looks perfect to you and you output it, and then the typeface looks bitbacked or fuzzy, or it doesn't render correctly. Well, the reason is because that font is not free to use for production. They designed them so that you cannot embed the font in a PDF or, a high-res, any kind of high-res output for printing. So that's another thing to watch out for, if you're using free fonts. And everybody does. People just don't think about it. It's like the Wild West out there. But I use real typefaces that I own the license to. So I know that when I put it in a file and the publisher or the author takes that file and uploads it, to LSI or, Kindle Direct, or sends it to a conventional printer, that font is going to render and print exactly the way it should.
Which makes sense. And it's similar to images. A lot of the free sites that you can use images for, you can't actually use them for anything that you're going to make money off of.
That's right. And they're clear about that. And just because it says it's free to download, you make sure that you go and read that fine print. It's like a two-edged sword. First of all, nobody wants to get sued for copyright infringement. Nobody wants that. Secondly, you don't want to go grab an image that, 75 other people are going to use on their cover because it was free.
Which happens in Lesbian Fiction.
It really does happen a lot. It really surprises me because, I know that, in the aggregate, we publish lots and lots and lots of books, but boy, we shouldn't see the same images used over and over on as relatively small as our community is.
That's all for this week, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
I'm Sheena, and this has been The Great Cover-Up with Ann McMan. You can find links to Ann McMan's online presence in the show notes, as well as a link to our Patreon page. If you love the content we create and want to support us, that's where you go. It's patreon.com/The Lesbian Talk Show. Not only can you help us expand our shows, but you get exclusive content too. That's all for today. Join us next week for episode 3. Bye.